The Ferguson 20 actually had twice the tyre capacity for its weight and twice the tyre capacity for its power than a lot of modern tractors would have today on the standard tyres that they'd be supplied with. So we've gone backwards in terms of tyres. Despite the tyres being huge, the tractors and the weights involved have got so much bigger that we really haven't kept pace.
If there's one thing all farmers can agree on, it's that no matter what type of machine, be it a Jeep, a small tractor or large tractor, a good set of tyres makes all the difference. There isn't a farmer out there who regrets investing in quality tyres, especially in wet conditions. And many often consider the benefit of wider tyres in their tractors. You are listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. We would really appreciate it if you could listen, follow and give us a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcast from. I'm delighted today to be joined by Dermot Forristal, a machine researcher at Teagasc Oak Park. Over the course of his long career, Dermot has built up an extensive knowledge of all things related to farm machinery, as well as soils and agronomy. In the first of 4 episodes, where Dermot will be joining me to discuss how developments in the machinery industry has influenced modern farming practices. In this episode, we're talking about the topic of tyres, traction, and how the wheels we use impact the soils we farm.
The big innovation is one that's getting more commonplace now, and that's the introduction of, I suppose, the more flexible tyre carcasses that you hear about called, I suppose, VF and IF technology. So this technology was, believe it or not, was probably introduced nearly 20 years ago by Michelin on their Zeobib range, but it was quite kind of expensive and slow to get going at that stage. It's still expensive, but nearly every tyre manufacturer out there has this technology available on at least some of their tyre sizes, and it's getting more commonplace. And it is a little bit of a game changer because it means that tyres of a certain width and a certain size can carry 25% or 40% more weight than they did in the past, or put it a much more important way, they can carry a given load at either 25 or 40% lower inflation pressure, and that means lower ground pressure.
Okay, but before we get maybe deep dive, maybe right down into that, we might maybe just go back a little bit in the past, because in fairness, you've had a long career looking at all these, and you're reminded of information and everything to do with tyres and tractors and that kind of stuff. But if we go all the way back to, I suppose, the very early days, and look, I suppose tractors probably started out, whether they were steam engines converted back into tractors, or that transition, there were kind of steel wheels back in the early years, which probably didn't provide a huge amount of traction. And the grey Fergie or tractors around those kind of came in, which kind of had skinny tyres, I suppose, Dermot. You know, in comparison to the larger tractors today, were those tyres to the tractor that they were on kind of fit for purpose?
Yeah, it's a fair evolution there, all right. I suppose when tractors moved to tyres, and that would have been, I suppose, before the Grey Ferguson, they moved towards tyres. But I think you're right. I think the Grey Ferguson kind of epitomizes a certain type of design that came in tractors, and we've followed that design really up to now, but we've made it much bigger. So what I mean by that is the Grey Ferguson is centered around the 3-point linkage and implement mounting. And in Europe, that's really the design that we still have today, but it's much bigger. And you're right, that brings into point, I suppose, the size of tyres and the appropriateness. It's really interesting to look at that example that you raised, Michael, because the Grey Ferguson was characterised, I think, if you saw one today, by how small the tyres would look. They were 4 by 19 on the front, so that's 4 inches wide, 100 millimeters wide, and the back wheels were 10 by 28, fitted with 10 by 28 tyres, so 250 millimeter wide tyres, 10-inch wide tyres on the back. They looked tiny compared to something today, absolutely tiny. But the thing to look at, though, is the weight of the Ferguson 20. It weighed around 1.2 tons, okay, just over a ton. And with an implement on it, its rear axle load was something similar, something in that kind of range of a ton or a little bit more. And if you looked at the capacity of the tyres, small and all as they were at the time, if you looked at their capacity to hold that load at a certain pressure, and you compared it with a 150 or 160 horsepower tractor today, The Ferguson 20 actually had twice the tyre capacity for its weight and twice the tyre capacity for its power than a lot of modern tractors would have today on the standard tyres that they'd be supplied with. So we've gone backwards in terms of tyres. Despite the tyres being huge, the tractors and the weights involved have got so much bigger that we really haven't kept pace.
And just with that, is it could you happened to mention there a second ago around the 3 point linkage, kind of a European kind of thing. Is that did you mean is that different to the likes of America or elsewhere where they're kind of larger, more drag type scenarios?
Yeah,
And we have maybe heavier loads on some of the axles we have here.
yeah, exactly that, Michael. There is quite a difference, and it's there for good reason. I mean, and Ireland in particular, I suppose, we're working in smaller size fields and that mounted arrangement of attaching implements is extremely versatile in a small field. Your headland turn space can be quite small, quite maneuverable, quite fast in a field, good field efficiency, and so on. Whereas, if you look at bigger open areas, it would be centered around trailed equipment. Even when it was smaller than it is today, it was still trailed equipment. And in the past, in countries like the States, and that quite simple equipment. In other words, you had a strong tractor, but it was strong just to tow. It didn't have to have a big heavy rear linkage. If they had rear linkages at all, and some of them they were quite light and weren't designed for carrying heavy loads. So the European tractor is more complex, heavy, much heavier lift capacity, but imposes a much bigger rear axle load. So it's something we do need to think about, Michael, in terms of where we go if we are going bigger and bigger in terms of our tractor size, because people have moved to, up towards 200 horsepower tractors. I won't say they're everywhere, but they're common. And they're not just with contractors, they're common on our farms now. That's the size people seem to be comfortable going with. But these tractors are 8 tons weight before you have anything on them. Even any front weights, not to talk about an implement. You're about 8 tons weight to start with. So from a tire perspective, and ultimately from a soil protection perspective, they ask lots of questions.
If we go back again to some of the kind of around the Grey Fergie time, and looking at some of the old photographs there was a certain proportion of crawlers out there that were working in fields as well. Obviously, they seem to have died out in the meantime. Was there I mean, were they useful back then, or what was the reason that they didn't stick, if you like?
I suppose if you go, yes, way back, you had crawlers and you'd steel wheel tractors. The crawlers gave you much better traction than a steel wheel tractor did way back at that time. And I suppose in Ireland, they didn't last, they weren't as in universal use, but in the UK, on very heavy clay soils, where farm size was quite big in the UK, where machines didn't have to move between farms, the crawlers lasted a long time. And in a sense, they evolved into, I suppose, some of the rubber tractor configurations that you might see today. So they lasted much longer there, and that was their big weakness would be, travel, a distance between or moving from one place to another. Kind of steel crawler couldn't really be driven on roads, and that was probably what limited them a lot, in Ireland and that. But like their running gear would be quite expensive to run and to maintain, and it meant that tractor really was a single operation tractor. So it was really for traction use in the field. So it was a specialist tractor. So again, that's probably why it dropped out in Ireland as an option very quickly when rubber wheel tractors came along, because they were much more versatile.
Going back to my time, I suppose when I was a young fella, I remember my cousin managed to get himself one of the four county tractors, and geez, I thought that was the biggest and largest tractor I think I've ever seen. And I suppose even to this day, you'd look at it in terms of the tire or the wheel size rather, maybe than the tire size. But was that considered an innovation at the time? Or the tires, if you like, were they more suitable to the larger weights?
Yeah, they probably were, but in many ways, the county arrangement was more to do with traction, I suppose, than ground pressure. So you had four equal wheels, and you had a relatively heavy frame and structure on the front that gave you a good bit of weight onto that front wheel. So you got good use out of those front two wheels. So from a traction perspective, obviously all the weight of the tractor was being put to very good use with the county kind of design. But like other than that, tire size, yeah, depended on what they were fitted with. Some of the counties weren't fitted with particularly wide wheels. If they were fitted with wide wheels and wide tires, they could be quite reasonable from a ground pressure perspective, and compared to tractors of today, could be quite good. I suppose the downside of the county design, really, even back when it came out first, was its maneuverability. They were not the most maneuverable tractors because you had a drive shaft. Not alone had you the big wheels on the front, limiting your turning angle, but you had a drive shaft coming from each of the rear stub axles. They had two drive shafts, if you like, and they also interfered with the steering lock. So the steering lock was very poor, but they were very stable and quite low to the ground in terms of their center of gravity. So from that perspective, from traction and stability point of view, they did have advantages.
And then I suppose the flotation tires probably appeared a little bit around the 1980s, but they
Mm.
didn't. I suppose maybe they might have been on some of the larger farms, but they didn't really become much of a standard, really, did they?
Yeah, I suppose you're talking there about the specialist flotation, like the Terra tires, the big
Power
wider
tires,
ones.
yeah.
Yeah, like they were an American tire design. They were actually a cross-ply design, and yeah, they got big footprints, but they weren't really a traction tire at all. So they were kind of again, you'd really have to you'd be putting them on and taking them off. And my early days of research work looked at some of that in a different context on wetland silage making and stuff, and they weren't the easiest to handle. So from that perspective, I suppose, it was difficult, but they were used a little bit. Yes, they were for, sometimes autumn spreading and spraying on winter cereals, and indeed sometimes in the cultivation or sowing operation. But they weren't a great traction tire, even though they did get fairly low ground pressure, but they were restricted, I suppose, in the numbers of sizes and things like that as well. So no, they did fall out of the equation, I suppose, for most people, but there's still some specialist use for them.
I suppose Jules were probably the more popular choice, and they're probably still on lots of farms out there. They
Mm.
were, was it the reason that they were more popular because they were a bit more flexible? You could stick them on. I mean, they're pretty heavy. I suppose a lot of them you can still fall over and make a mess of you,
Yeah.
but they were probably a little bit more flexible, I suppose, were they, Dermot?
Yeah, look, the dual wheel option, I think in the 1980s, we actually had a very good mix at that stage from a ground protection perspective when people started using dual wheels for the tractor that was cultivating and sowing. Okay, so if you like, there was a big move, and we'll talk about this again, Michael, in terms of cultivation maybe in a different time. But there was a big move towards one pass equipment in the 1980s, but it was centered around tractors that were maybe from 95 up to 120 horsepower, that sort of size. These tractors weren't too big, okay? And when you fitted those, their standard wheels might have been 16.9 inches wide, 420 millimeters wide, something like that. So when you fitted those with dual wheels and even allowing for a bit of space between the tires, they were still around, maybe just under 3 meters width in total. So that was considered manageable, I suppose, at the time. And that actually gave you, from a ground pressure perspective, looking at the size of tractors on a typical one pass at a time, those dual wheels really did bring us well down in ground pressure, down to zero point 0.8 bar or less in terms of the required inflation pressure. And that's a very good guide to ground pressure. So that option was really, really good at that time. But I think what happened really was that tractors outgrew the duals to some extent. In other words, as tractors got physically bigger, their axles got a little bit wider, their standard wheels got bigger, and suddenly, when you put duals on those, they were beyond that 3 meters width, and they became less convenient, if you like, less manageable, moving on roads and so on. And of course, you had the hassle of having to change them and take them off. But mind you, I think today that would probably be a bit safer. It's more common, and their TAMs grant aided to have, wheel dollies for lining up wheels and so forth. But the dual was a good option at that time, and in many ways, we haven't succeeded in getting back to the ground pressures we had with a good dual setup in of the 1980s.
But I suppose just to bring up the wheel back a little bit in terms of those, you mentioned the VF tires. They are a good advancement, and you can some of these larger tractors you're talking about, 150, 200 horsepower tractors that are fitted with these, can they get down to that point 0.8 of a bar you're talking about?
Yeah, they can. Now, I think the target in terms of pressure depends on what the situation it's working in. And I would say point 0.8 bar pressure, that's the size of tire that you should be using if you're working on any sort of cultivated ground at all. Now, if you're actually primary cultivation, such as ploughing or initial stubble cultivation, you'd probably get away with a little bit higher, maybe 0.9, 1 bar pressure. So just to kind of put that in context. But in answer to your question, in terms of VF tires, yes, they can certainly get you down because, as I said at the beginning there, what the VF tire does is it gives you that bit more deflection to play with. Um, and what that does really, okay, it widens the contact patch a little bit, but it makes a much longer contact patch. So the tire is distributing its weight over a bigger area. And to give you a kind of an idea, like those bigger tractors, certainly 150, 160 horsepower, maybe up 180, with a typical load, maybe a 5 for a plow on the back or a 3 meter one pass, something like that, you're still talking about axle loads there, about 8 tons on the back axle. So if you had, say, a common size would be something like a 650 65 by 38. Farmers would be very familiar with that size. If you had that as a standard tire, you'd require an inflation pressure of about 1.4 bar. Okay, remember we're trying to get back towards 1 bar, zero point 0.8 bar, so it'd be 1.4. If you had that in the same size, a 650 65 38 in a VF tire, right, you would be right back to about zero point 0.9 of a bar. So you're coming back into the region where you want to be. Probably that would be quite acceptable for ploughing. You might like to be a little bit lower with your, working on till ground, but it's a huge difference. It's, matter of fact, it's probably better than these are 650 mil wide tires. It's better than 800 or 900 millimeter tires in standard technology, if you know what I mean, without the VF or IF.
Explain to me why that is. Is it the tire it has a bigger footprint when it gets to the ground, or what's the reason that it's so lower?
What allows it happen is the technology in the carcass of the tire. If you tried to do this with a standard tire, to run it at the pressures that a VF tire could run at, the tire just wouldn't last. You'd damage the carcass, it would overheat, the carcass would crack, and your tire just would not last because you'd be running it flat, as it were, or seemingly flat. The VF tire has a carcass, and the IF as well, that will withstand that sort of level of deflection. And how it works then is, for any given load, you have an inflation pressure. And this is across all tires. And if you're trying to get the most out of your tires, you do match the inflation pressure to the situation. So what you should do is run at the lowest pressure that's allowed for the particular load you're carrying. In our case, we're talking about 8 tons. With a VF tire, you can run that at a 40% lower pressure than the standard tire. And how it works, Michael, is it lengthens the contact patch, right? Or what some people would say is the number of lugs in contact with the ground
Okay.
increases, right? So you have a longer patch and a lower ground pressure.
A farmer's in the field, he's a VF tire on, the inflation pressure is down fairly well, and he's working away. As you mentioned earlier, a lot of the farms are fragmented in Ireland, so there's a good bit of road work to be done. Farmer lifts up that 4 for a plough, drives back out onto the road. Does that tire need to be reinflated with all of that weight, now on top of that axle to go onto the road?
Yeah, if you really get the most out of it, yes, right. But what I would say is, and now this is the same whether it's VF or standard. In other words, if the standard tire is running at the lowest pressure it's capable of in the field, it will also need to be increased on the road. But I think most people will have them at the pressure for the road, and I would accept that. In other words, the inflation pressure that you require for a particular load depends on the size of the tire, the load obviously, and the forward speed. So if you look up the load and inflation pressure tables, you'll see that they'll have a particular load that you can carry with the tire at 40 kilometers an hour, at 30, and the next one is usually down to 10 kilometers. Now, you could use that 10-kilometer one in the field, right? Having said that, you want to be careful if you're doing something like ploughing, because from a traction perspective, the tire may slip on the rim, which is not necessarily a good way to be. But what I'm saying, I suppose, is that most people will probably run it at the pressure in the field for the 30 or 40 kilometers on the road. But you're right, there's more to be got from it if you're prepared to drop it further in the field. And you can do that because you're lower speed operation, but then you're going to have to pump it up if you're going on the road. So in the comparisons I'm doing, I'm looking at it at 30 kilometer or maybe 40 kilometer speed ratings and looking at it that way. And it's still, the VF technology still, has the same edge, if you like, percentage edge over a standard tire in that scenario.
You mentioned those. You mentioned, Dermot, those tables in terms of
Mm.
figuring out how much pressure is needed at given weights and speeds. How hard are they to find on the internet?
They're not that hard. It depends on the tire brand that you have. Now, normally they're independent of brand. In other words, they're all following more or less the same tables. There used to be a standard called the ISTRO, but that standard, it's safer to look up the actual manufacturer, to be honest. But you will find them. You find your tire type. It's a Michelin, it's a Goodyear, whatever it is, a BKT. BKT ones are quite easy to find, actually. You just Google in your type. You must know what type of tire as well as its size, and that's whether it's an AgriFlex or a Zeobib or whatever it is. And you look up the load and inflation pressure tables. So it really is worthwhile once in your tractor's lifetime to have your tractor and get to a weighbridge with those key implements, whether it's the plow, whether it's the one pass, whether it's another cultivator, min-till cultivator, whatever it is, and weigh what's on the front axle and what's on the rear axle with that implement lifted. Okay, that'll give you'll have that figure forever then in terms of what the actual axle load is. Then go to your load and inflation pressure tables and see what pressure you require for the different scenarios, for 40k on the road, 50k on the road, whatever it is, or what you can go down to in the field. The one actually that gets most use in the field for lower loads and low speed loads would be the combine. The combine does use its kind of 10k speed, working speed in the field to allow you to go to lower pressures. And the reason you get away with that with a combine is there's a huge difference in the load on the front wheels of a combine when it's running in the field with a full grain tank than there is on the road. So when you come out on the road, you take the header off, you have an empty grain tank, so there's no need to reinflate the tires because the load is reduced dramatically. Whereas in the field, that header on the front and a full grain tank increases the load a lot, and you're able to use that 10-kilometer load capacity in the field for setting the pressure of a combine. That's the one case for that. But yes, it is worth weighing the equipment once, knowing what loads you're dealing with, and going to those load and inflation pressure tables for your tires.
Dermot, for some of the very biggest tractors, some of the really big ones they've turned back to those rubber tracks, as you mentioned earlier. Some of them are, I suppose, like the Caterpillars or a full track, or maybe like some of the other tractors that are there to have individual tracks for the individual wheels. Is that something that's going to take off even more, or I suppose it must be more costly, I suppose, than the tire?
Yeah, it's usually more costly, and the reason is simply the width of the machines, Michael. In other words, if you're trying to suddenly put 300, 400, 600 horsepower on the field, both in terms of weight and in terms of traction, to try and transmit that power with tires, you would get very, very wide. And in the past, this would have been, you'd have pictures in your mind, Michael, probably from the States again or Eastern Europe, of huge tractors with double and triple wheels on their axles. Perfect in the field if you never leave the field, but you can't move them on the roads. So the tracks give you this long, long contact patch, right? And that means that you don't have to go wider and wider. And that's why we see tracks on combines today, because the combine is quite a restrictive machine. It has a working part in the middle, the drum part and that, which for a big combine gets wider and wider. And then you fit your wheels or tracks outside of that. So if you want to fit very wide wheels, you just make a hugely wide machine that's impossible move on the road or get into fields and so on. So the bigger combines are often fitted with tracks for that reason, because you have a long, slightly narrower carriage, if you like, and that doesn't increase the width of the combine to the same extent as the same ground pressure capacity tyre would do. Okay, so that's really the role of tracks in modern equipment.
Dermot, one final question, and maybe it's to really kind of get you thinking here. But if you were a farmer and the relatively reasonably sized farm, 300 acres or say, and you had a relatively big tractor, some like those ones we were talking about earlier, 180, 200 horsepower type tractor, and it needed to be shod with new tyres, what would you do? Would you invest in some of these new high-tech options we were chatting about, or would you take a different approach?
Yeah, I'm tempted to say, Michael, I wouldn't
Like at
start there.
home.
I wouldn't start there anyway in the first place. As in, your mix of those bigger tractors, if you're talking, I think you mentioned 200 horsepower. That's the first thing to think of. Is that what you need on that size? Because remember, in the future, between weed control issues and everything, if that's 300 acres, is that going to be 150 acres of spring and 150 acres of winter crops? So I'd say look at all that to see, is it justified going for that size tractor? Because that's your 8-ton tractor, and that's expensive to get out with tires. But to answer it from there, then, once you've answered that first part, the answer to that then, like 300 acres is limiting enough. If you look at the expense of some of those tires, a VF tire and a big size tire, to get that, they are quite expensive. So I'd answer it this way: if your tractor was never going anywhere off your farm, if your farm was in one decent block, I wouldn't rule out going towards dual wheels. Okay, I'd always think of that as an option. But outside of that, I think you would be forced. If you're 200 horsepower and you're matching equipment for that, 5 for a plow, you're back up to 9-ton axle loads. You're actually forcing yourself back towards expensive tire technology, I think, because you have no other way to protect your soil. Most of the field will be fine. What you really get hammered is the headlands if you're using mounted equipment on a tractor that size. And yes, I think you're forced to your VF tires, and a decent size VF tire. So it is going to be an expensive tire. They'll last a long time. Of course they will, unless you damage them in that scenario. But they will be an expensive spend. But if we're going to use equipment of that size, we have to protect it. And as I say, dual wheels would be difficult in that scenario, but it wouldn't rule them out in some cases.
Okay. Dermot, listen, thanks very much. You're a mind of information. There's a load in there. And we will come back, as you mentioned earlier, we will come back and chat a little bit more about the cultivation equipment and how you protect, I suppose, cultivate in the first place in terms of getting the best out of it, but also protect that soils as well. Dermot, again, thanks very much.
No problem, Michael. Thanks.
So that's it for this week, and my thanks to Dermot for joining me on the podcast. Join me over the course of the next few months where Dermot will come back to me and we'll chat a little bit more about machinery and how it's influencing your business. So finally, if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening. I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.